Hey, Jon Tyson here. Thanks so much for joining us for our Controversial Jesus series. This series is a response to questions that were emailed in from our congregation about what it means to follow Jesus in a moment and place like ours. So I hope you go ahead and enjoy this talk. If we can answer any questions you have or serve you in any way, please reach out to us, hello@churchofthecity.com, and you can follow along with this series on our podcast or this YouTube channel. Cheers.
The teaching text this evening comes from Philippians, chapter 2, verse 1 through 11. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This is the word of the Lord.
When somebody agrees to take a job, they negotiate an hourly salary. And for whatever that salary is, that is called their wage. They show up, they get paid a certain dollar amount, and then they leave. There's another concept that's probably another level up from that, that is called rent. And not rent like you would pay to your landlord, but the concept of rent in an economic sense, meaning you do the job for $20, but they're paying you $50. That little $30 yield, that's called rent. And as I was thinking about these principles, I was asking myself, is there anything better than rent? And there's the concept that certainly all artists and creative dream about. It's the concept of royalties. Royalties are where you do something once and you don't do it again and you still get paid. This is also called mailbox money, where you just sit there and the checks just come in. How many of you have a vision for your life that looks like royalties, perhaps? I was thinking, is there anything better than this? And there is. It's the concept of privilege. Privilege is where you do nothing and you get something. It's where you do nothing at all to earn anything and you still get things. One day when I was in the South, the United States, I was driving along, exploring America in a car. And as I was driving along, I realized that this is before cell phone technology. I was driving along and I realized that I had missed my exit. And I didn't know what to do, so I just started driving the wrong way down the interstate just to get back to my exit, because it certainly seemed like the quickest thing I could do. So I'm in reverse pretty quickly, gunning it down the road. And then I see these sirens approaching. And the sirens pull up behind me. And an officer gets out and he says, "Excuse me, sir, do you know that you were driving the wrong way down an interstate?" And I said, I had a vague feeling. "I'm sorry, mate. I'm from Australia. I'm not quite sure where I'm going. And I'm trying to get over there." At which point he said, "Well, let me help you." and turned on his lights and helped me drive backwards down the interstate and get to my exit. Now, in all seriousness, if I was another race, do you think that would have happened? Getting a police escort to drive the wrong way down the interstate to get to your exit, that's called privilege. I did nothing. He happened to want to visit Australia. And he happened to always be curious about Australia. And he happened to love Australians. But I did nothing to earn any of that. He just saw me and saw that I had certain characteristics that he appreciated. Therefore, he exerted favor and privilege on my behalf. And in our series tonight, we're moving away. Some of you are like, what's that got to do with sexuality? Well, praise the Lord. We've moved on from sexuality in our Controversial Jesus series. And someone was clapping, yes. And we're going to spend a month now talking about power. Controversial power. And tonight we are talking about the concept of privilege. Now, it's not lost on me that if there was a person in our society that possesses privilege, it would be a graduate level, educated, white man. That's who I am. And I'm teaching this tonight not because I'm an expert on this, or not even because I'm completely aware of the dynamics of this, but because this was a question that you wanted to know. Our culture seems like it's being pulled apart. Such strong reactions around the issue of privilege. And so I thought it would be good tonight to talk about Jesus' discipleship and the concept of privilege. So what is this theory of privilege that we are talking about? Well, I first came across this because it was an article in the New Yorker talking about the origins of privilege. And I don't know if you saw this article from some time back. But when young folks are talking about privilege today, they probably mean something a little bit different from previous generations' understanding of it. For folks today, privilege has a justice connotation connected to it. It's an exclamation point about something that's not right in the world. And this article points out that in the 1930s, W.E. Du Bois wrote about the psychological wage that enabled poor whites to feel superior to poor blacks. During the civil rights era, they talked about white skin privilege. But privilege, as we define it, really came into sort of current focus when Peggy McIntosh, a woman studies scholar at Wellesley, started writing. And in 1988, she wrote a paper called White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. And in this article, she cited 46 examples of white privilege. So, for example, number 21, I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. Number 24, I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to a person in charge, I'll be facing a person of my own race. And this has shaped our modern understanding of this concept of privilege. So here's one definition of privilege. Privilege is unearned access to resources or social power that are only readily available to some people because of their social group membership, an advantage or immunity granted to or enjoyed by one societal group above and beyond the common advantage of all other groups. So here's just a couple of the dozens of kinds of privilege that are listed in these sorts of discussions. Number one is racial privilege. Secondly, religious privilege. Then you have class privilege, gender privilege, citizenship privilege, depending on where you're born, orientation privilege. There's ways that if you possess one of these factors or were born into or inherit one of these factors, that things will be readily available to you that you haven't earned, that other people will not be able to access based on who they are. Now, this is a deeply controversial issue in our society today. For some people on one side of the cultural continuum, they just dismiss this as social justice warriors looking for another cause to point out the flaws of the world. On the other side of the issue, for people, this holds the explanatory power of why it's been so hard for them to make their way through the world. And tonight I want to talk about not just the left and the right's vision of privilege, but what would Jesus do with privilege? So let's try and understand this issue before we diagnose it and understand it according to Jesus' vision. So on one half of the culture continuum, privileges look through the lens of rights. And on this side of the continuum, people are saying, we have to get rid of privilege because privilege exists because people's rights are being violated. Over here, privilege is connected to justice. So this would play itself out in a typical example. There was one example that sort of made its way around. I'm not sure this, and this was from BuzzFeed. Did any of you happen to see this? BuzzFeed presents the privilege questions. If you haven't seen this exact version of it, you've seen several versions of it. So basically they get a random grouping of people together and they start out on a line together, showing that they're all equal in terms of their worth. But based on privilege that exists in societies, they ask them a series of questions to either move forward or take a step back so you can understand the effects of privilege on your life. So a couple of questions, for example, if your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take a step back. If you can move through the world without fear of assault, take a step forward. If you've ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take a step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take a step forward. And this goes on all the way through discussing race and gender and every other kind of privilege you can imagine until they come to the end. And at the end, in this particular example, the person with the least amount of cultural privilege was a black lesbian woman. And so in their sampling of people, she was at the back with the least amount of privilege. In this framework, where privilege is primarily about justice and it's about rights, and privilege is seen as something bad that should be deconstructed and addressed, people's thinking is primarily on a structural and systematic level. So I was talking to a friend of mine about this issue, and I said, look, I've lived in the United States half my life, but I realize there's hundreds of years of history and dialogue that I don't understand. And he said, let me just give you an analogy about how life feels for many people. He said, I want you to imagine there's a group of people playing Monopoly, and they play Monopoly for 1 hour, and all of the best properties are taken, and the properties are loaded up with hotels. And then you're invited to join the game. And you're honestly really happy an hour later because you love Monopoly to be in the game. But you have no money, and so you're just trying to get around and make it past go. And instead of the game being a game of joy, it's a game of fear where you're praying and hoping for luck that you don't land on a property that somebody owned and established power on before you were allowed to play. And then after you play a few rounds and you're robbed of everything you have, you realize the safest place for me in this game is jail. He says this in many ways, for many groups of people, is what it feels like to participate in our culture. And this has the idea of structural and systemic privilege, which means you can't quite figure out where it is, where it comes from, and how to make sense of it. This phrase is often described in a word, intersectionality, which means that there's just all of these interacting pieces that make it so hard to decipher and discern the exact source of where this injustice is coming from. Now, this term intersectionality is from a black legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, and she coined this term in an essay in 1989 which was easily entitled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. But this is the analogy she gives to the word intersectionality. Considering an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a black woman is harmed because she's at an intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination, but it's not always easy to reconstruct an accident. Sometimes the skid marks and the injuries simply indicate that they occurred simultaneously, frustrating efforts to determine which driver caused the harm. So you can imagine making your way through life, and if you've got privilege, Just like the movie Bruce Almighty, where you sort of just walk straight through. Everything seems to stop, and the path is easy, the path is clear, the path is forward. But if you're born without privilege, and you try and get across a busy, and there's just forces everywhere, economic forces, racial forces, religious forces, family forces, educational forces. So many things could be hindering your journey, and you can't quite understand what they are. And in this framework, this cultural understanding of privilege as something that is hindering the flourishing of many groups of people, it's normally a communal a communal sense of identity and understanding about how life works. The result of this, if taken to its extreme, is something we feel in our society today. Nietzsche had a concept called ressentiment, similar to resentment, but a little stronger, that he says this is what can happen or leak into the bones of people who feel a constant source of frustration. And he says if this happens where somebody takes on an identity of frustration, then this is what occurs. Ressentiment is grounded in a narrative of injury, or at least perceived injury, a strong belief that one has been or is being wronged. The root of this is the sense of entitlement, but not in a bad way, a sense of entitlement a group holds. And over time, the perceived injustice becomes central to the person's and the group's identity. So I think this is manifested in some sense in Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Now, I read this book, and this book moved me. And it may be because I have a teenage son, and I speak to my son about the world a lot. But what he wrote to his son about the black body and American history and structural injustice and racial inequality and the kind of future that his son would grow up in. I mean, there was moments I just broke down and wept. And I was waiting as all fathers try and cast a vision for their sons about the kind of world they're going to live in and what can happen. I kept waiting for a turn of hope, but it never came. And it just ended with a sense of sort of nihilistic bitterness. And so I talked to many of my African American friends and I said, help me understand this book. I was so moved by this book. I was educated by this book. But I just left with despair. And they said, we read it and we did too. That's some people's experience. And this can often, if taken a step further, result in rage. James Baldwin, who was writing during the Civil Rights era, said, to be a black person in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. And we see a sense in our culture of people protesting. How long? Still? Come on. This boils up. So for some people, as they make their way through life, privilege is something that hinders them. It's something that should be destroyed. It's something that is blocking their opportunities, and it's something that gives indicators to them that life is systemically unfair towards people like them. That is one side of the understanding of privilege. Now, on the other side of the discussion about privilege, you get an opposite framework. For these people, privilege is about responsibility. And for them, in many ways, privilege is seen as some sort of myth. And this is the other side. Forget privilege, worry about personal responsibility. So, Thomas Sowell, who is an economist, an African-American economist, wrote several books, but in one interview he gave, he was talking about the effects of victimology on our society. And he was responding to an article that Nicholas Kristof wrote in the New York Times, where he stated that there is strong evidence that centuries of racial subjugation still shapes inequality in the 21st century. And for Sowell, this just produced a sense of anger. So he writes this: if we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state. In other words, we would compare hard evidence on the legacy of slavery with the hard evidence on the legacy of liberals. So then he goes on. Despite the grand myth that black economic progress began or accelerated with the passage of the civil rights laws and the war on poverty programs in the 60s, the cold fact is that the poverty rate among blacks fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% by 1960. This was before any of those programs began. Over the next 20 years, the poverty rate among blacks fell another 18% compared to the 40% drop in points in the previous 20 years. And this was the continuation of a previous economic trend at a slower rate of progress, not the economic grand deliverance promised by liberals and any self-serving black leaders. Ending the Jim Crow laws was a landmark achievement, but despite the great proliferation of black political and other leaders that resulted from the laws and policies of the 1960s, nothing comparable happened economically, and there were serious retrogressions socially. Nearly 100 years of the supposed legacy of slavery found most black children being raised in two-parent families in 1960. But 30 years after the liberal welfare state found the great majority of black children being raised by single parents. The murder rate amongst blacks in 1960 was one half of what it became 20 years later after a legacy of liberals' law enforcement policies. Public housing projects in the first half of the 20th century were clean, safe places where people slept outside on hot summer nights. This was before the admissions of liberal public housing project visions, where standards were lowered and abandoned in a non-judgmental notion. The same toxic message produced similar social results among lower-income people in England, despite an absence of a legacy of slavery there. And he says this, he closes by saying, if we were to go by evidence of social retrogression, liberals have wreaked more havoc on blacks than the supposed legacy of slavery they talk about. Liberals should heed the title of Jason Riley's new book, Please Stop Helping Us. So other scholars would say something like this on the other side of the continuum. There's 3 ways to get ahead in America. It's simple. Finish high school, don't get pregnant out of wedlock, and get a job. If you do these things, you will not be poor in America. However, if you fail to do these things, you don't finish high school, you get pregnant out of wedlock, and you don't work, you will likely be poor regardless of the color of your skin. And so the result of this, on this side of the continuum, it's just, look, accept responsibility for your life. Just do the right thing and life will go well for you. These issues were a long, long time ago. And the result amongst many folks who our culture would consider privilege is 2 things. Number 1, it's defensiveness whenever this issue is raised. I've worked for everything I have. I haven't taken advantage of anybody else. I've taken responsibility for my own life. I'm not relying on the government or other people. Everything I have, I've earned. Nothing's been given to me. Or the classic, look, sucks to be somebody else, man, but I've only got a limited amount of margin. Not my people, not my problem. This sort of defensiveness was manifest in Tal Fortang's article that showed up in a Princeton magazine, where he responds to checking your privilege. Did any of you see this? This actually sort of went viral. And I'm just going to read you a little bit so you can feel this sense of defensiveness. The phrase handed down by my moral superiors descends recklessly like an Obama-sanctioned drone and aims laser-like at my pinkish peach complexion, my maleness, and the nerve I displayed in offering an opinion rooted in personal responsibility. Check your privilege, they tell me in a command that teeters between an imposition to actually explore how I got where I am and a reminder that I ought to feel personally apologetic because white males seem to pull most of the strings in the world. I do not accuse those who check me and my perspective of overt racism, although the phrase, which assumes that simply because I belong to a certain ethnic group, I should be judged collectively with it, toes that line. But I do not condemn them for diminishing everything I've personally accomplished, all the hard work I've done in my life, and for ascribing all the fruit I reap, not to the seeds I sow, but to some invisible patron saint of white maleness who places it out for me before I even arrive. Furthermore, I condemn them for casting the equal protection clause, indeed the very idea of a meritocracy, as a myth, and for declaring that we are all governed by invisible forces, some would call them stigmas or societal norms, that our nation runs on racist and sexist conspiracies. Forget you didn't build that. Check your privilege and realize that nothing you have is actually ever accomplished for real. But they can't be telling me about everything I've done with my life and be credited to the racist patriarchy holding my hand throughout my years of education and eventually guiding me into Princeton. Even that's too extreme. So to find out what they are saying, I decided to take their advice. And I actually went and checked the origins of my privileged existence to empathize with those underdog stories I can't possibly comprehend. And if you want to read the whole account, I encourage you to get online. But one of the themes I'm sort of sensing in this response is just perhaps a touch of defensiveness against the claim here. The other side, if you're not defensive, is paralyzing guilt. Look, I get it, man. This is just so unfair. But what can I do about it? I didn't ask to be born this color or this gender or in this location. I had no control over it. And I can't change a system that's been around for hundreds of years. And I'm not even sure I understand it. And every time I do try and help, I feel attacked because of my cultural clumsiness on this issue. I just feel paralyzed by guilt. So to just pause for a moment and ask the question, what comes up in your heart when you hear the word, you have privilege? What happens in your heart? How we respond to this as followers of Jesus may be one of those issues in our culture that determines whether or not we have credibility in our message to the larger world. Jesus has a response to privilege. So let's look at Jesus and privilege by returning to our teaching text today from Paul's epistle to the Philippians. So this is what it says again. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. And being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even to death on a cross. Now, this passage, if you look at it in terms of its context, has sort of broken out of the genre of pure epistle and is now moving towards hymn or poetry because it's so beautiful. And I want to submit that in all of religion and all of philosophy, you will struggle to find something more compelling and more beautiful that reveals the nature of who God is and what he is like. This verse is filled with the wonder of Jesus. This is what it says. Though he was equal with God, he didn't consider his equality something to be grasped. He didn't use it to his own advantage. Jesus viewed his privilege differently than many others. And he made himself nothing. He took the nature of a servant. Now look, occasionally I do servant things. But Jesus had the nature of a servant. I do servant reactions. He had servant instincts. And he entered the world this way. And he humbled himself. And his humility was so low that he embraced the cross. Public shame. Death outside the camp. The God of the universe left his throne and used his privilege for others. 2 Corinthians 8 says this, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. So my take, if you were to talk with Jesus, if Jesus was to roll in here tonight and to preach, which many of you would prefer, as would I, and Jesus was to sort of share a few thoughts on privilege, instead of saying privilege is just about rights or privilege is about personal responsibility, and you were to say to Jesus, what do we do with privilege? I think there's a chance that Jesus would say, you need to redirect your privilege. You see, America as a nation is obsessed with winning. We love winners. And we love the direction of up and to the right, man. Just progress and winning. This is the nature of this nation. And it's brought hope to many people. But when it doesn't happen, we feel like we've been robbed. Hard for the American church to understand that the cultural privilege you've accumulated isn't just so you can enjoy it. We have to be shocked by the redirecting of the things we possess for the sake of others. So Rob Wilkins says this: in the vocabulary of the world, down is a word reserved for losers, cowards, and the bear market. It's a word to be avoided or ignored and certainly not discussed seriously, especially in polite society. It's a word that colors whatever it touches, even the otherwise proper company of words that it keeps. Down and out, downfall, downscale, downhill, downhearted, and worst of all, down under. A word, it seems, I feel judged by my group. A word, it seems, only on the unfortunate lips of the weak, the poor, or the dead. If all that weren't enough, there is this crowning blow against the word. Its antonym is up. And up in our high voltage society is a word that has come to be cherished, almost worshipped. It is a word reserved for the winners, heroes, those who know their bull. It is a word to be admired and pursued, the unspoken talk of the party, the way to influence whoever is present, upscale, up and coming, upwardly mobile, upper class, the word for the chosen few and the strong. And my favorite up word is upgrade. You want an upgrade, JT? Yes, I do. Upgrade me, please. We love this direction. But I want to argue that what we see in the life of Jesus goes contrary to much of what our culture says. For Jesus, the call is that of redirection. Now, let me just pause for 1 second here to add one pastoral note. If I was preaching this talk in a church that was filled with folks primarily of a different color or a different social standing, the talk would sound different. The same talk would be about empowerment. The same talk would be about don't let anybody tell you you can't. But because I'm dealing, for the most parts with an extraordinarily privileged congregation, our framework here is about deconstructing privilege. So I'm just trying to tell you why I think it's important to present it this way to people like us. Okay, the power of redirection. What sort of power does redirecting privilege have in our culture? Well, the first thing, redirecting our personal and corporate privilege actually jams up the culture of intersectionality. All of these forces sort of woven together, blocking the pathway so that people can walk through the world. But we read in this verse that Jesus became obedient to death, even death on a cross. This is the ultimate intersectionality. God himself in the world, blocked and opposed by sinners, by religion, by systems, by power, and by politics. And they take a hold of the Son of God and they drag him outside the city and they crucify him. But in what can only be described as a staggering reversal, it is the public failure of Jesus Christ that deconstructs the privilege of the world. Because now when people come to Jesus, they don't bring themselves as winners, but as failures, producing humility as the basis of our faith. That means when we move through the world, we do it humbly with the vision of others. We read this in Galatians chapter 3. Jesus, after he deconstructs the religious and the racial and the gender hierarchies, makes this claim through the Apostle Paul. So in Christ Jesus, you were all children of God through faith, and all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are in Abraham's seed. You are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Now, N.T. Wright makes an observation about this passage that is kind of extraordinary. Every day in synagogue liturgy, there was a prayer that Jewish men prayed, and the prayer said this: thank you, Lord, that I am not a woman. Thank you that I am not a slave. Thank you that I'm not a Gentile. This is a part of the daily prayer. And Paul didn't want followers of Jesus who, through the equalizing, redirecting power of the cross, to step into a system that was upholding a hierarchy that was holding others back. And so by now saying that there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, nor male than female, you can no longer go into the synagogue and say these prayers because they're not true for you anymore. So you have to be forced back into the church where these barriers and hierarchies have been flattened by the cross and participate in an alternative community that is a new humanity. So rather than just a casual doctrine about justification, this is cultural subversion that creates a new humanity in the world. The church should be this place where the things that block others in the world are removed and we're equal in Jesus. Redirection through the cross jams the culture of intersectionality. Now, it's possible that this doesn't happen how we want it to happen, but it's still what they're arguing through this passage. The second thing that happens, if this gets done right, is it creates an alternative community of possibility in the world. Who else has this script as they interact with one another? Back to Paul's words. Therefore, verse 1, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, any tenderness and compassion, if you have a spiritual pulse, then I put that bit in there, but I think he really that was where he's heading. Make my joy complete by being like-minded. Have the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. How many of you, it's rhetorical, how many of you, your life is motivated by selfish ambition and vain conceit? The word in the Greek has the idea of a politician on campaign for himself. Rather, in humility, value others better than yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but also the interests of others. So how many of you came here tonight and your honest response was, oh my gosh, I cannot fathom that I get to be in the room with them. Like, how did I make it in here? I can't believe I get to be a part of this. This is Paul's vision of the attitude that should enter. And so if you get a community of people who genuinely are looking to the interests of others, who genuinely believe that others are more important than themselves, this will unleash a new horizon of possibility about how they use their privilege in the world. So I can't think of a more appropriate example for a community than perhaps the one like ours, than William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect. Now, Wilberforce has been popular because of movies and books that have been written about him. But his story is still extraordinary and an example for us today. In fact, there's 3 historic communities that have influenced my life that I've literally arranged my life vision under, and Wilberforce and the Clapham sect is one of them. They were a group of extraordinarily privileged English nobles. And when he was a young man and he was converted, he had a passion to go into the ministry, but he met with a certain gentleman, you might have heard of him, wrote a song that's done quite well called Amazing Grace. But he met with him and just basically asked him for some advice about what he should do with his life. And he was told, don't become a pastor, stay in politics. Now, when he was in politics, he did have some friends who were doing quite well for themselves. For example, his closest friend was the Prime Minister of England, and they did have a small group of cultural elite friends, but what did they do with their wealth, their power, their privilege, their influence, their resources, and their energy? Well, what did they do? They cared about others. God gave them as a community 2 great missions in the world. Number 1 was the eradication of the slave trade. And secondarily, it was what they called the reformation of managed, but what we would call cultural renewal. And so they used everything they had to campaign against the greatest systemic injustice of their day. They were told it's impossible, it's baked into the culture, it's too financial, the economy runs on this, we can't undo it. But this didn't deter them because they knew that they were called by God to redirect their privilege on behalf of others. It cost them. Rather than setting up family foundations that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, a lot of them went broke within 2 generations, just throwing their resources to break open this system of injustice. They used their power in publishing, in literature. They used their power in politics. They used their public to shape the cultural imagination. And they gave everything they have. And a couple of days before Wilberforce died, They saw the final passage of an act that outlawed slavery in the British Empire forever. They started almost 70 non-profits in their day, including modern versions of Bible societies, Sunday schools to educate the poor, and even the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, because they believed they were a part of God's creation. This little, may I add, creative minority here, tucked together as an alternative community of possibility in the world, shaped their generation, and they did this by redirecting privilege on behalf of others. So not only does it jam up intersectionality and make a clear path for others, but it broadens that path using personal privilege so the way becomes broad. This is the power of redirection. So you may be sitting here tonight and asking the question, well, how do I redirect the privilege that I've inherited in my life? So three quick observations from this text, and believe it or not, we will close. Number one, it's taking on the posture of consideration of others. And I know this seems like a small thing, just the phrase considering, but there is so much power in lifting your vision beyond the borders of your own life. Francis Schaeffer, who was one of the great intellectual statesmen of a previous generation, as he was dying, blasted a warning to the American evangelical church. And this was his warning. The American church has to care more than just about personal peace and affluence. He said, if the borders of your heart extend only to those you know and care about, and your efforts to provide extend only to the borders of their provision, the church will die and become irrelevant. And isn't that happening in our world today? If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the death rattle that personal peace and affluence have brought to the modern church. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. In humility, value others above yourselves. Look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. The church was supposed to be this place where when you stepped into it, the horizon of concern lifted from your family to the family, and from the family to mission in the world. And any time the church lost this vision, God got angry. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you read these extraordinary statements about how the Corinthian church was operating in terms of their small group structure and their public worship services. There were some good things happening there, but one thing they got wrong is that when they would do communion, they wouldn't do the intinction like we do. They would have full-on feasts in homes. But because there was wealthy, privileged people there, they would come early because they didn't have to work, and they would be drunk by the time everybody else showed up, and they would have eaten all the food, and they would be in the best part of the house. And then the slaves in the lower class who had to work late into the day would show up. And when they got there was no space in the house. There was no food left. And everybody was drunk, and they were excluded and reminded that in this church there was slave and master. And then Paul writes this terrific phrase. He says this, when you come together, it is not the Lord's table that you are celebrating. Your gatherings do more harm than good. Can you imagine this rebuke? Stop your church programming. This is awful. This is awful. And yet this is what we read. The church at its best is considerate of others. Personal peace and affluence do not define the operating system or the size of the heart. There's a book, I recommended a book to you, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, and many of you have been reading that. And there's an account in this book. Many of you have been reading that and saying how much you've appreciated it. So you're welcome. Haters gonna hate. So there's an account from a document called the Didascalia, which was basically the teaching of the apostles, that was addressing the problem that there was great income disparity in the church, that very poor people would show up and very wealthy people would show up. And so these apostolic injunctions were sort of like, how do you handle it culturally? And I just want to read to you a section of how they dealt with the poor coming into church. What if a poor man or woman should arrive? What if a poverty-stricken person comes, whether from the same district or another congregation, most especially if they are well on in years and they have no place? Then the bishop should do something exceptional. Listen, you bishop, the didascalia orders, shall interrupt your sermon and make a place for the poor people and give them your own chair. You should act for them from your heart. Even you should sit on the ground yourself. The bishop, the community's leader, is to make a scene. By embodied example, he's to teach behavior that demonstrates the community's convictions that in the church all Christians are of worth, that the church has no special regard for wealthy or eminent people, and that the church honors poor people. In the assembly there shall be no respect of persons or of worldly eminence. I love this idea of making a scene, that there should be a special place of honor. There's a green room. There's a VIP section, but it's for the poorest people. On a separate note, I'm also encouraged that people are walking into church late in the first 200 years of church, because I just thought it was me, but apparently pastors have been wrestling with late attenders, both poor and rich, for the entire history of the church. Considering, secondly, humbling ourselves. So there was so patriarchy seemed too soft a term for some feminists in their response to how controlled society felt. So Elizabeth Schlesser Fiorenza, in her 2001 book, Wisdom Ways Introducing Feminist Biblical Interpretation, came up with another term, and the term, which is a fascinating term, kyriarchy is the term she defined. And this is from the Greek word lord or master, kyrios, and to rule or dominate, archaion, which seeks to redefine the analytic category of patriarchy in terms of multiplicative, intersecting structures of domination. Kyriarchy is best theorized as a complex pyramidal system of intersecting multiplicative social structures of superordination and subordination, of ruling and oppressing. So she's just basically saying there's a societal structure where a few people at the top have become lords and everybody has to serve them. Kyriarchy. Now, what does Jesus say about this? Well, in Mark 10, if you were to ask Jesus, what do you think about a society ordered this way? He'd say this. After the disciples are fighting about who are going to be the greatest, verse 42, Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who were regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So it is our job as those who are under the true Lord to deconstruct kyriarchy in such a way that a new kind of lordship enters the world. And by following Jesus, we are those who humble ourselves and serve. Now, I want to define humility here from one of my intellectual heroes, John Dixon, because he lays this out in such a powerful way. Humility is the noble choice to forgo your status, your resources, or to use your influence for the good of others before yourself. The humble person is marked by a willingness to hold power in service of others. 3 key distinctives. Number 1, humility presupposes your dignity. The one being humble acts from a height, so to speak, as the lowering etymology makes clear. True humility assumes the dignity or strength of the one possessing the virtue, which is why it should not be confused with having low self-esteem or being a doormat for others. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it is impossible to be humble in the real sense without a healthy sense of your own worth and abilities. Secondly, humility is willing. It's a choice. Otherwise, it's humiliation. And finally, humility is social. It's not a private act of self-deprecation, banishing proud thoughts, refusing to talk about your accomplishments, and so on. I would call that simple modesty. But humility is about redirecting of your powers, whether physical, intellectual, financial, or structural, for the sake of others. And I want to argue that in the fragmented, polarized society that we live in today, this kind of humility is the call of the church. And then lastly, we empty ourselves. It says that Jesus emptied himself and gave up his rights. He was about something other than himself. We see this in Isaiah 58, 9 through 11. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with a pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Now, every week, I feel torn as a pastor and one of the few people who control the Church of the City Instagram account for what I share. Because I'm a part of a feed of our community group leaders, of photos and stories that come in every week of what people in our church do. And there's so many beautiful things happening in our church. So tonight I'm going to hijack the screen with a few of those photos for you. So here's just an example of some incredibly privileged young people. Many of them graduates from the finest schools in the world. And what are they doing? They're taking this thing in New York that is sacred called their margin, their weekends, and they're redirecting it for the sake of others. They are humbling themselves in the biblical sense of the word to love and to honor other people. Next slide. This is another beautiful scene from the South Bronx. And this is just young women using what they have to love and bless others. Next slide here. This is a scene from the South Bronx, just a circle of prayer and concern before they love and they serve. And if you would talk to many of these folks, they're not there with some sense of importance, like we're here to fix things. They are there to pour themselves out and to learn from others and to love. Next slide. Just here at St. Paul's House in Hell's Kitchen, they seem to be having a good time humbling themselves as well. I just love this vision. I think, is there one more? There's not. Well, I just want you to know that our church is doing this. And that there's so many beautiful things that are happening. And here's the thing. It's not that those without privilege are being served. It's that those with privilege are being changed. Their hearts are becoming like Jesus. This is what Andy Crouch says. The most transformative acts of our lives are likely to be the moments when we radically empty ourselves in the very settings where we would normally be expected to exercise authority. The question we ask in spiritual formation is not, what am I doing? As much as we're asking, who am I becoming by what I do? And when we as individuals in a community redirect our privilege, we become like Jesus in our hearts, in our lives, and in the world. So I close by saying, I believe that the redirection of our privilege, which you and I possess an incredible amount of, is actually an opportunity for the church. It's an opportunity. In John 13, you see one of the most extraordinary accounts in all of human history. You have Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, and he's celebrating the Passover with his friends. And again, this is an account where they're saying which of them is to be the greatest. And it says this. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. So here's what I think our call is in our cultural moment. Our call, while the world is debating left and right, whether or not privilege is about rights or whether it's about taking personal responsibility, in the midst of the cultural discussion, Christians need to just leave the table and take on the garment of sermons and wash the feet of the world. Just to do it. Just to do it. To be in the world in ways that get into these intersections of opposition and through small acts personally just hold up some signs so that some people can get through. This is our call. And Jesus says at the end of this, something extraordinary. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. No servant is greater, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So let me ask you a question. Are you aware of the privilege you have? Are you grateful? How has God spoken to you about how to steward this on behalf of others? Where do you sense the Spirit leading you into the world, leading you into other people's lives? How will you do that personally? How will you take on the posture of redirection to use what you have for the sake of others? And then how can we as a church community figure out opportunities in the place that God's called us to be an alternative community in the world, where a group with as much privilege as us can humble ourselves and serve and redirect what we have. Privilege isn't a thing to be bantied around in political terms. It is the moment and opportunity for followers of Jesus in our world today. So may God give us the grace, may God give us the heart, may God lift our eyes and our vision to open the borders of our compassion that others may come in.